Olayemi, what's on your radar?
For the first time in our nation's history, the Supreme Court has taken away a constitutional right. In a 6-3 decision in Dobbs versus Jackson, the Supreme Court destroyed almost 50 years of precedent and overruled Roe versus Wade, ending the right to an abortion. And with the loss of that right, many others hang directly in the balance, a fact that the Republicans and their Supreme Court are not only aware of, but they're counting on it, so they can continue legislating from the bench, which is precisely what they did here. Originally, Mississippi had appealed to the Supreme Court and asked only that the court review its 15-week ban under the then law, which was blatantly unconstitutional. Then, RBG died, the Republicans put Amy Coney Barrett on the bench, and then, and only then, did Mississippi challenge the constitutionality of Roe altogether, which is in and of itself improper and unusual. They backdoored the issue. It was never litigated, because they knew they had a court filled with Republicans who, despite all swearing in front of the Senate during their confirmation hearings that they respected Roe as protected, long-standing precedent that the country has relied upon, and assured the American people that they had no agenda to overturn, would be prepared to act in a manner Republicans would be calling judicial activism if it had been the Democrats doing so, or if constitutional principles and integrity were what this was about. Each year, the Supreme Court is asked to hear more than 7,000 cases. Of those 7,000 cases, they only choose a measly 100 to 150 cases. And they didn't choose to hear or decide new, pressing issues. They chose to hear and decide a case involving long-settled areas of constitutional law that the large majority of the country still supports, because it gave them the opportunity to not just launch us into a dystopian future, worse, to move us backwards in time, to an America without choice, not just for women, but for all of us. 13 states already had trigger laws on the books, which are laws meant to take effect should Roe ever be overturned, meaning there were 13 states poised to launch their citizens into the past the moment this day came, 9 of which did so the minute the decision was issued and banned abortion. At least 26 states are expected to ban abortion altogether. One of those states are Texas, where Governor Abbott tweeted out that overturning Roe was the right decision because, quote, Texas will always protect unborn children from the ravages of abortion. This is the governor of a state that doesn't protect the living children in its care from being ravaged by AR-15s. The governor of a state that has had multiple school shootings, 6 of the 12 largest mass shootings in the country, but chose to lax the gun laws further and continues to defend them after 3 of its police departments stood idly by while a 4th grade class was massacred. Texas has one of the worst educational and foster care systems in the country. Texas has the highest infant and maternal mortality rate in the developed world and the lowest mental health care access in the country, the antithesis of protecting children or life. Yet, all abortions will be illegal in Texas by the end of July. Doctors could face life in prison and fines up to $100,000 if they perform abortions they've been lawfully performing to people who want them for the last 50 years. According to an AP journalist, West Virginia's only abortion clinic has already stopped performing abortions. The clinic began canceling the appointments on Friday of 60 to 70 patients who had already been scheduled for abortions in the upcoming weeks. And some patients broke down and couldn't even speak through their sobbing, were stunned to silence, or just simply couldn't understand how this was happening to them. Despite an injunction making abortion legal in the state of Michigan, Michigan's largest health system, Beaumont Health and Spectrum Health, is following the 1931 state abortion ban, except for when a mother is going to die. Maybe you don't care about women and every other marginalized group that stands to suffer from the devastating ripple effects of overturning Roe. Maybe you don't care that women will die trying to seek now unsafe abortions. Maybe you don't care that women and girls will be forced to carry the babies of rapists, that women and girls will be criminalized for miscarriages they couldn't prevent, for medically necessary abortions. Maybe you don't care that states that have demonstrated absolutely no interest in providing for its most vulnerable populations now pretend to be their champions when it's time to force them to have children they will not help them provide for. Maybe you don't care about the inconsistency in the people decrying the government is violating their rights by being asked to wear masks for the safety of themselves and others in a global pandemic are now the same people celebrating that same government forcing women to carry unwanted pregnancies. Maybe you don't care that rich people will still be able to seek the abortions they need, but poor Black and brown women and girls will suffer disproportionately. Maybe you've bought into the bad faith anti-choice propaganda that abortion is Black genocide, when in reality, The maternal mortality rate for Black women nationally is 3 times that of white women, and anti-choice politicians like Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy boldly announced that their maternal death rates are only bad if you count Black women. So we know how they really feel about both Black mothers and unborn children. Maybe you don't care that about 4% of all newly incarcerated women are pregnant, and those women will be forced to carry unwanted pregnancies behind bars. Maybe you don't care about any of that, but do you care about yourself? Everyone's heard of Roe versus Wade, and I'm sure there are a significant amount of people who feel unaffected by Roe. But while I'd wager most of America hasn't heard of Griswold versus Connecticut, you will be affected by a world without it. Because without it, you not only don't have the right to an abortion and a string of other rights, you have no constitutional right to privacy, and that impacts us all. What do we mean when we say the right to privacy? In Griswold versus Connecticut, a married couple challenged the constitutionality of a law that prohibited married couples from using contraceptives. The court found that before the Constitution, we always possessed the right to privacy, meaning the right to make decisions in our intimate and personal lives, and the Constitution could not be construed to deny or disparage that fundamental right to privacy. In other words, the government has no business making decisions in our bedrooms, especially where married people are concerned, because marriage is a deeply rooted institution in our nation's history. It's that fundamental recognition that allowed the court to not just recognize our right to use contraceptives, should we wish, which is why that argument that people should just use birth control in the wake of losing the right to an abortion is an uninformed one, but more importantly, eventually, our right to an abortion, our right to marry outside of our race, our right for people to marry the same sex, the right for gay people to have sex with one another, because yes, this country did criminalize gay sex up until 2003, and that's where they're headed now. And for the Republicans, always clamoring about a war on parents and your right to protect your children from being informed about history and the rights of others, it's also how the court recognized your constitutional right to direct the upbringing of your own children. But apparently, the only ideal rooted in our nation's history the court seems concerned with honoring and protecting is bigotry. Anyone telling you that you have nothing to worry about or that the rights aren't in danger is either disingenuous or not paying attention. Alito states that we must overturn Roe because the U.S. Constitution makes no explicit mention of the right to an abortion, which is both interesting and incorrect for several reasons. First, because the Ninth Amendment explicitly provides that we have constitutional rights that have not been enumerated in the Constitution. And two, the Supreme Court is only even able to hear and decide cases based on the principle of judicial review, which is nowhere to be found in the text of the Constitution. But he says this intentionally, because he then lays the groundwork for overruling constitutional rights that protect women, LGBT people, Black people, and every other marginalized group that the court has previously legitimized the abuse of, insisting that any right not deeply rooted in our nation's history is not a constitutional right. And to illustrate his point, he goes on at length about the fact that because America once criminalized abortion, that means they didn't intend us to have this right. Do you know who and what else has been criminalized in our nation's history? The entire LGBT community, who up until SCOTUS decided Lawrence versus Texas, were criminalized for simply having consensual sex with one another in the privacy of their own homes. The LGBT community, who up until Obergefell, just 7 years ago, couldn't legally be married. Black people, who were quite literally enslaved by this country. And by Alito's logic, slavery would be constitutional and in keeping with this nation's history and principles, barring the amendment expressly prohibiting it now. Anyone in an interracial relationship who up until Loving versus Virginia were criminally prohibited from dating and marrying outside of their race. This danger is not speculation, it is impending, which the dissenting justices explicitly recognized, stating, no one should be confident that the majority is done with its work. The rights Roe and Casey recognize does not stand alone. To the contrary, the court has linked it for decades to other settled freedoms involving bodily integrity, familial relationships, and procreation. Most obviously, the right to terminate a pregnancy arose straight out of the right to purchase and use contraception in Griswold. Alito weakly attempts to convince us that overturning Roe doesn't concern the other precedents it's anchored in, but the dissenting justices called he and the majority out for the flawed reasoning as either dishonest or hypocrisy. They stated, the majority is eager to tell us today that nothing it does casts doubt on precedents that do not concern abortion, but how could that be? The lone rationale for what the majority does today is that the right to elect an abortion is not deeply rooted in history. The majority argues that until Roe, people didn't think abortion fell within the Constitution's guarantee of liberty. Well, the same could be said of most of the rights the majority claims it is not tampering with. The majority could write just as long an opinion showing, for example, that until the mid-20th century, there were no support in American law for a constitutional right to obtain contraceptives. So one of two things must be true. Either the majority does not really believe its own reasoning, or if it does, all rights that have no history stretching back to the mid-19th century are insecure. Either the mass of the majority's opinion is hypocrisy, or additional constitutional rights are under threat. It is one or the other. But if you still doubt it, the reality that all these decisions were on the chopping block, or whether Republicans were legislating from the bench, Clarence Thomas took the time out in his concurrence to make sure there was no confusion. He expressly said that the court had a duty to correct the error that is Griswold versus Connecticut's right to privacy and every right that flows from it, more specifically, the rights to contraceptives, the right to same-sex marriage, and the right to same-sex sexual relationships, except one right he left off his list, the right to interracial marriages, because he may not care about women or anyone else benefiting from the right to privacy, but he sure cares about himself. While seeking to overturn every right to privacy case that involved the rights of marginalized groups he didn't identify with, he was sure to exclude the only one that does benefit from as a black man married to a white woman, Ginny Thomas, who is currently under investigation for her role in the January 6th insurrection. If you doubted whether Republicans were disingenuous in their celebration of this descent into fascism as a win for states' rights, behind the scenes, they've already begun planning to pass a national 15-week abortion ban should they gain control of the House and the Senate. And in front of the cameras, we have Congresswomen thanking Trump and the Supreme Court for this victory for white life. It doesn't end there. It's only a matter of time before we see these states start passing laws aimed at overturning these other rights and attacking the LGBT community in particular. Anybody who's been paying attention knew this was coming. Long before the draft opinion leaked and we all readied ourselves for what was to come, advocates have been warning for years that Roe was in danger, and they were dismissed as alarmists. While that was happening, RBG refused to retire for no ascertainable reason beyond ego, to the detriment of a nation full of women who had championed her. No matter how much people pleaded she retire and give Obama the opportunity to appoint someone in her place, instead, we ended up with Amy Coney Barrett. And all that doesn't speak to why, in almost 50 years, Democrats never made any real steps towards codifying Roe in the first place. We've allowed an illegitimate court to legislate from the bench in order to legitimize bigotry. So where do we go from here? If Republicans are so concerned about only valuing what's spelled out in our Constitution or what's deeply rooted in our nation's history, I cannot think of a better time to remind them that absolutely nowhere in our Constitution are we required to have 9 seats on the Supreme Court. In fact, we started with 6 and we've changed the number several times. So 9 seats is also not deeply rooted in our nation's history or what the framers intended. Democrats can either sit by or expect their voters to sit by while we lose right after right from this Republican court. Now more than ever, they need to pack the court and fight back.
We're going to end up with a court that's as big as our Congress. They'll pack it, and then the Republicans will pack it right back, and we'll just have a second Congress.
You know, it's so funny because so many things are like that, right? Even if you think of even the size of Congress and the committees we had, they originally had cases challenging that too, right? Mm-hmm. Scalia didn't want that. He said we would end up with JV Congress if we had, you know, committees and what we have now to make it functionable. And we did it anyway because we decided that was the only way that it was functionable. I don't think 9 people rolling back the rights of the country and descending us into chaos, because regardless how you feel about it, you have to acknowledge that there are a significant amount of people that are impacted, a significant amount of people that are not going to let this rock. You're going to see protests, you're going to see riots, you're going to see all kind of uprising, because this can only get worse. And at the end of the day, you have to do what's better for the best for the people in this country, not just holding on to, in this case, not even really precedent. If you don't respect the precedent of people's rights, I don't know how 9 seats is so sanctioned.
No, is 9 seats not sacred? I absolutely agree with you there. They could do it. I just don't know tactically. The thing Democrats need to do is just win. They just can win elections and then enact laws. I mean, you could have a law that protects abortion rights. You could have a law that actually says gay marriage, instead of trying to read it in the Constitution, it's protected because we just passed a law saying there's gay marriage. Just like what you had to do for slavery. You had to actually have a constitutional amendment to make it spelled out. You can't take that back because it's spelled out. If you spelled out these other things by actually having your people win elections and then do those laws, this wouldn't be left to the Supreme Court to decide.
While I love to criticize the Democrats, especially, I have lots of fair criticism for them. In this case, Republicans did this not by winning. They did it by getting their people on the Supreme Court. And let's not act like they did it by all the most legitimate of means. They've done some things in this year, right? From Merrick Garland, Brad Kavanaugh,
shady.
There's a lot that's happened. So let's not act like they didn't do what they needed to do to usurp this process and bring us here. So in that case, the way they did it, Democrats need to play the game. I'm tired of us holding Democrats to a standard we don't hold Republicans to, and then it leaves the rest of us handicapped, okay? I'm not in the business of that. I'm interested in what's going to be best for the people and getting our rights together. I don't want to see a row happen, and now I watch it trickle down to rights until I no longer recognize this country.
Well, I will tell you what's coming up on my radar next, so stay with us.